Today is the 7th of July, 5 days away from the Vilnius summit, the NATO summit meeting, which has been built up for the last couple of weeks, months even, as a crucial event in determining the future of the NATO alliance and, of course, the direction of the conflict in Ukraine. Two countries in particular will be, to some extent at least, participating in the Vilnius summit, each of them seeking NATO membership. One is Sweden, and the other, of course, is Ukraine. Now, Sweden's application for membership of NATO appears at the moment to be facing insurmountable Turkish opposition. The Turkish government is extremely angry, not just about Sweden's continued support as they see it for the Kurdish movement within Turkey itself, but of course their feelings have been aggravated, intensified still further by recent Quran burning incidents in Sweden, which have appear to have hardened feelings in Turkey. When dealing with a volatile personality like President Erdogan, who is the ultimate decision maker about these sort of matters, it is essential to say that the implacable opposition that he appears to be announcing today might turn out on the 12th of July in Vilnius to reverse itself completely, and I don't think it is impossible that he might nonetheless, in spite of everything, agree to Sweden's membership of NATO, provided the price for him is right. Ukraine, however, is the much bigger and more important problem, and we see now the doubts starting to proliferate at almost every point, and it's becoming increasingly clear that Ukraine is not going to join NATO at Vilnius. I don't think anybody, except perhaps a few people in Ukraine, thought that it would. It will have to go through a prolonged procedure to join NATO, and it seems that for the moment, NATO is not even prepared to put that procedure into place. And the latest word is that with the NATO summit just days away, there is still no agreement amongst NATO member states as to what exactly to offer Ukraine in lieu of NATO membership, what precise proposal they're going to make to Ukraine, given that even a timeline for Ukraine to join NATO for the moment continues to be ruled out. Now, why are we in this position? And I'm going to suggest that there's an overwhelmingly simple and straightforward reason, and that is the failure up to now of Ukraine's offensive. This Ukrainian offensive, as I've discussed numerous occasions, was first debated, discussed, floated way back in the autumn. It was supposed to be part of a series of offensives starting in late August of 2022. First offensive that achieved a kind of breakthrough for Ukraine was the offensive that Ukraine launched in Kharkiv region. That actually began in September. First Ukrainian attacks were in Kherson region at the end of August 2022, but the big Ukrainian breakthrough was the one that took place in September when Ukraine launched an attack on the Russian-controlled town of Balakleya in Kharkiv region. The Russians pulled back from Balakleya, and then they abandoned large areas of Kharkiv region, including the towns of Izium and Kupiansk, to Ukraine, enabling the Ukrainians within a couple of days, about 2 weeks, to capture this large area of territory in Kharkiv region. Ukraine suffered very, very heavy losses from Russian airstrikes and artillery strikes over the course of this offensive, but its advance was rapid as the small number of Russian troops in Kharkiv region pulled back. And then there was the other big offensive that Ukraine did launch. This was in late August 2022, the offensive to recapture Kherson city and Kherson region on the west bank of the Dnieper River. This was an extremely difficult offensive. The Ukrainians heavily outnumbered the Russian troops in this area, most of them, or at least the core of them, drawn from Russia's airborne forces. They suffered very, very heavy losses. They achieved no breakthrough. But in the end, in the late autumn, the new Russian commander of the Russian forces involved in the conflict area, General Surovikin, took the decision that Russian troops should be pulled back from Kherson region west of the Dnieper, including Kherson city, because he was worried about the risks that this Russian force might be marooned, cut off from resupply west of the Dnieper. And of course, there were already worries at that time that Ukraine would launch some kind of attack on the Novaya Kakhovka dam, that the dam might be ruptured, that would sweep away the Russian communications with this force west of the Dnieper, and that force might be cut off. I think another further reason for Surovikin's decision, by the way, was one which I suspect was widespread within the Russian military and general staff, which is that with the advance on Odessa and Nikolaev, which had been floated in the spring and early summer of 2022, called off, there was really little purpose in keeping those Russian troops west of the Dnieper River. That doing so, in effect, isolated some of Russia's best troops, some of its paratroop forces, west of the Dnieper River, where they were no longer, in effect, participating in the major Russian effort, which was in Donbass, in Kherson region, east of the Dnieper, and in Zaporozhye. Anyway, that was the second offensive, and again, the Ukrainians eventually reached their objective, their proximate objective, which was Kherson city, though they never succeeded in destroying the Russian forces that had defended it, because the Russians carried out a successful and orderly withdrawal of all their troops, suffering minimal losses in the process. But the Ukrainians, for their part, suffered extremely heavy losses, and the result was that the third offensive that was supposed to follow on the previous two, the one in Kharkiv and the one in Kherson, the one that was supposed to be decisive, the Zaporozhye offensive, the one that was going to be launched to cut the land bridge between Russia and Crimea, well, that had to be postponed. And there was, I suspect, some debate about whether or not to launch that offensive at all, but a decision was eventually made that at some point it would be launched. But Ukraine, having suffered very heavy losses in equipment and material and men and supplies, needed re-equipment, and there was a series of meetings in January, February, by NATO, and decisions were made to supply Ukraine with tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and the Ukrainian troops, in the meantime, to operate these machines were being trained to operate them in order to launch this offensive. And preparing for this Ukraine offensive took an inordinate amount of time. We know from Pentagon leaks that it's an original plan. The original plan was to launch it on the 30th of April. It was then expected that it would take place at some point in May. Failed to take place in May. And it was eventually launched on the 4th of June. And the offensive, for what it's worth, continues to be underway. But it has been underway now for more than a month. And it has achieved no significant progress at all. In no part of the front lines has Ukraine achieved any significant breakthrough. In Zaporozhye region, where the main part of the offensive was supposed to take place, where the towns of Tokmak and Melitopol were supposed to be captured, where there was the breakthrough planned that would reach the Sea of Azov, which would break the land bridge and supposedly isolate Crimea from Russia. Well, the Ukrainians are still trapped in protracted and difficult and extremely costly fighting. In the grey zone, they've captured a few deserted villages, but they've not even succeeded so far in reaching the main Russian fortified lines. And this despite apparently tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops killed or wounded, despite hundreds of armoured vehicles destroyed, despite, most embarrassingly, pictures circulating all over the world showing burnt-out Leopard 2 tanks and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and increasing numbers of Stryker wheeled infantry fighting vehicles, all destroyed on the battlefronts. And as I discussed in recent programs, even as the offensive in Zaporozhye region and in Kherson region has failed to achieve any breakthrough, despite exorbitant losses, Ukraine, instead desperately seeking some kind of breakthrough somewhere, launched its offensive instead. In that area where there's been all that bitter fighting, starting from November, going all the way through the winter, right up until the 20th of May, the place being, of course, Artyomsk, the town formerly known as Bakhmut, which the Russians, the Wagner group, captured on the 20th of May, the loss of which, after a protracted defense, also caused Ukraine exorbitant losses. But anyway, Ukraine has been drawn back into battles to try to recapture it. And as of this morning, I'm continuing to read claims in the Western media, especially the British media, that Ukraine is continuing to make advances in the area of Artyomsk, the former Bakhmut, though very interestingly and rather unusually, the British media, Reuters and other agencies, are admitting that there is now a major divergence between Ukrainian claims of advances on the flanks of Artyomsk, the former Bakhmut, and Russian claims that these advances have actually been thrown back and even reversed, and that over the last couple of hours it is the Russians, in fact, who have been back on the attack in this area and that they've regained most or even all of the ground that they lost to the original Ukrainian attacks. And incidentally, on this, I should say that I think the Russian reports are far more accurate. They come in much more detail. They give clear pictures of where the fighting has been. It's clear, for example, that the village of Kleshayevka and the other village of Kurdyumovka remain firmly under Russian control, that the heights, the commanding heights around these villages also remain firmly under Russian control, that certain fields and areas of farmland, which the Ukrainians captured at very heavy, cost of very heavy losses, have now also been largely recaptured by the Russians, and that in other places near the village of Berkovka, the Russians have also managed to regain some of the ground that the Ukrainians had taken. And for what it's worth, I've also seen claims that over the course of this fighting, over the last 24 hours, Ukraine lost around 1,000 men, dead and wounded. Russian losses in the same fighting are put at 250, so a 4-to-1 ratio favouring the Russians. This is what the Russians say, but also perhaps giving an indicator of the intensity of the fighting in this particular part of the battlefronts. And alongside all of this, yesterday also saw another attempt by Ukraine to try and achieve some kind of advance in the Orechov area. Once more, Ukraine followed what has now become its current tactic. It launched waves of attacks on Russian positions in the Orechov area, sending around 100 men at a time, lightly equipped infantry towards the Russian positions, but covered by artillery fire. But in every single case, it seems, the attacks were repulsed, again with heavy losses. So no Ukrainian breakthroughs anywhere on the front lines, despite the huge investment that the Western powers have made in this offensive. From their point of view, the outcome of this offensive has been deeply disappointing. And they're going to Vilnius, or they must be now preparing to go to Vilnius, concerned that the offensive that they've invested so much in is going to fail, and that they, for their part, as I've discussed again in previous videos, are without a real coherent strategy about what to do. Now, before I do this, before I discuss what's going to happen at Vilnius and what is indeed happening at the moment, focusing this time more on the diplomatic front than on anything else, I just want to return to this topic of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, because we've now had comments from Ukraine's now revived and highly visible intelligence chief, military intelligence chief, Kirilo Budanov. He disappeared for a certain interval of time, but he's now back giving interviews as he always was. He now says that the threat of some sort of explosion at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant has receded. And while one can't say that the danger of some sort of incident at this nuclear power plant has entirely gone, I would repeat again that it has been my clear belief that the Russians have never had any plan to launch any sort of incident at the nuclear power plant. But I have thought for a while that there was a real possibility that the Ukrainians did have such a plan, and that was what they might actually try to do. Now, during the night of the 5th of July, I should say more like the morning, the early morning of the 5th of July, in the lead up to the early morning of the 5th of July, there was abundant speculation that some kind of big event was going to happen at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. But nothing, in fact, took place. And as I said, there have been rumours that European officials, and indeed even European leaders, though we were never told which ones, spent the preceding hours telephoning Kiev, warning the Ukrainians that under no circumstances was any such attempt, any such incident involving the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant to be attempted. Now that is a rumour, it's unconfirmed, but what is confirmed is that the International Atomic Energy Agency has now been actively involved conducting investigations and inspections at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And they have issued reports which directly refute Ukrainian claims that the Russians have mined the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant or have any plan to trigger some kind of explosion or detonation or to stage some kind of accident at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The president of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mr. Rafael Grossi, has said that they have not yet inspected the roof of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, but that they expect to be allowed by the Russians to do so. The relevance of the roof is that in one of his statements, President Zelensky claimed that this is where the Russians had planted large explosive devices, crates of explosives, or something of that kind. There's actually now been satellite pictures taken of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant over the last few days since President Zelensky made that claim. They show the roof of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and they show no sign of any of the explosives that Zelensky said was there, actually being there. And it's likely that the Russians will agree to these inspections. And the IAEA will no doubt report that there is no explosive devices, any explosives where Zelensky has said they are. So it looks as if there's been some kind of intervention from the West, because, to be frank, I doubt that the IAEA would have acted in this way unless it had had backing from Western governments. There's been some sort of action taken by some Western governments to basically diffuse tension around the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Most probably the Ukrainians have been told not to attempt anything there, and the IAEA now seems to be actively cooperating with the Russians to refute Ukraine's claims about explosives located in the power plant. And I can't believe that that would have happened again unless the IAEA had been given a green light to act in that way by Western governments. So it looks as if, for the time being at least, the threat of some kind of incident at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant has receded. So, deadlock on the front lines. Ukraine makes no progress in its offensive anywhere, not in Zaporozhye or Kherson region, not in southern Donetsk region. not in Bakhmut, the Bakhmut area. A large amount of information that Ukraine is actually on the retreat in the Kremenaya, Saratovo, Kupiansk, Liman area in the north. There's been a good rundown of what's going on there, which you can find on Simplicius the Thinker's blog on Substack. The Russians seem to be incrementally and methodically continuing their advances there. But the key point is that Ukraine continues to take extremely heavy losses, but continues to be deadlocked. And there's no sign, there's no reason to think that that is going to change anytime soon. Certainly not within the next couple of days. Perhaps, most probably, not ever. So, we come back to what the West is going to do. And I have discussed many times, in many instances on these programs, the fact that the West needs to start looking for some kind of diplomatic solution to this conflict. That these mantras of supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, for vetoing any kind of negotiated peace that makes the kind of concessions that the Russians would be looking for if the war were to end, that this really isn't realistic or viable. And we've now obtained the first confirmation that some sort of diplomatic overtures have indeed been taking place, and that these have been initiated by the United States. And these diplomatic overtures began in April. And April is an interesting month because, of course, it was during April that the doubts about the prospects of the offensive, Ukraine's offensive, began to grow in the West. This was the time when there were increasing numbers of reports starting to appear that it would be extremely difficult for Ukraine to break through the enormous Russian fortified lines. In fact, the Ukrainians have never even reached these fortified lines. But anyway, it was around April that the doubts and the concerns that existed began to circulate and to become public. And by the way, and for the record, it was around this period of time, to the best of my recollection, that we started to get rumours about the Pentagon leaks that were starting to give us some insight into what US intelligence was actually reporting about the true state of the Ukrainian military and the fact that it was not really in any condition to achieve the kind of breakthrough that some people in the West were still hoping it might be able to achieve. And of course, there's been a great deal of speculation on the part of many people that these leaks could not have been just the work of one very junior military person, Mr. Teixeira, but that perhaps he was fed this important classified material, and that the fact that this material was appearing was a further sign of the internal debate that has clearly been underway in the United States, and which I've talked about many times in many programs, and which was launched by that Rand Corporation report, which appeared in January, which straightforwardly said that Ukraine has no realistic pathway to victory, and that a prolonged war in Ukraine was not in the interests of the United States. And at about that same time, a number of other reports started to appear, one by the CSIS, which is in effect the publication arm, the media arm of the US military-industrial complex, which was talking about the depletion of Western arsenals. And it was around this time also that the International Monetary Fund was publishing reports which first predicted that the Russian economy would actually grow this year, though in the event, its estimates of Russian economic growth this year have turned out to be much too low. It was predicting 0.7% growth for the Russian economy. The Russian Prime Minister Mercouris, says it's more likely to be 3 times that level, more than 2%. Anyway, but the first indications, as I said, in January, February, that there were some people in Washington, within the within the foreign policy and security and defense establishment, who were starting to push back. And there's been clear signs ever since of an ongoing argument between these relative realists, and I want to stress again, relative realists, and the neocon hardliners in the State Department, people like Victoria Nuland and the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, who are, or have been, and who continue to be, deeply unwilling to face the implications of the facts which show that Ukraine cannot win this war. Anyway, what we now know is that the people whom I'm going to call the Washington realists, led by Mr. Richard Haass, still at that time President of the Council for Foreign Relations, perhaps the premier establishment body in the United States, bringing together senior members of the foreign policy making community. Anyway, it was at that time in April that Mr. Haass and other ex-diplomats began to have meetings with senior Russian officials. And in fact, the Russian official that they met with at that time was the most senior diplomat in Russia's government, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. Apparently that happened in New York over the course of a General Assembly session. And it's clear that these people were not acting completely on their own. They had informed the US government, the White House, that they were going to seek this meeting. And though the White House is now saying that it did not actually support this meeting or endorse it, importantly, it took no step to prevent it. The US government, the Biden administration, deeply divided as it is, as we're going to discuss shortly, did not tell Mr. Haass and these other ex-diplomats that a meeting with Lavrov would be extremely unwelcome and would be opposed by the US government. If Haass and the others had been told that, I'm confident that no meeting would have taken place. And of course, in the absence of a prohibition, we have to accept this as a kind of green light. And Haass did meet Lavrov, and they did have discussions. We're not told very much about those discussions, but we know that Haass and the others then briefed the White House about the outcome of that meeting. And we're told that the purpose of the meeting, first and foremost, was to try to establish lines of communication with the Russians. And we are also told that the topic of the 4 regions was discussed. The US side was trying to glean from Lavrov what Russia's opinions, its decisions would be, what Russia's stance would be about the long-term status of these 4 regions. Now, the Russians up to now have denied that there is a back channel in existence between them and the United States, and they've said very, very little about this meeting. All the indications are that Lavrov took an extremely hard line and proved essentially immovable. He's made further statements since then, public statements, as have other Russian officials, which reiterate that the objectives set by President Putin at the start of this military operation in Ukraine, the special military operation, are unchanged and must be fulfilled in their entirety. In other words, neutral status for Ukraine, a demilitarization of Ukraine, what the Russians refer to as denazification of Ukraine, the extinguishing of any flickers of political groups associated with that ideology of the 1930s and 1940s, and, of course, protection for Russian speakers in Ukraine. And I would add that the Russians have also made clear that they expect Ukraine, de facto at least, to recognize the independence of Crimea and Donbass, and indeed now all of the 4 regions. That includes Zaporozhye, including, by the way, Zaporozhye city and Kherson region, which the Russians now deem to be a part of Russia, and which, according to the Russian constitution, the terms of the Russian constitution, Russia cannot agree to cede any part of to Ukraine. So this is the position I'm confident that Lavrov will have communicated to Richard Haass and to the others. Now, what we don't know, and what isn't clear, is whether there have been any other contacts between this group and the Russians. But I suspect that there have been, even though the extent and nature of these contacts is very difficult to, well, it's impossible at the moment to ascertain. I would add that Richard Haass himself has a history as President of the Council for Foreign Relations of being a very strong supporter of what might be called US policies, in effect neocon policies, in the Near East and Middle East and elsewhere, but that there have been growing signs over the last year or so that he has begun to have doubts, that he's beginning to think that the maximalist policies that the neocons have committed the United States to are unachievable and unrealistic and are possibly dangerous. And he has started to say that his major concerns now, as he prepares to retire from his position as President of the Council of Foreign Relations, that his principal concerns for the United States are not about the general global security situation, but that they are about the US's internal situation, the political polarization that exists in the United States, the purported threat that that polarization causes to the political stability of the United States and the functioning of its institutions, and that he thinks that the United States should draw back from its foreign policy commitments and concentrate on that instead. I'm going to say that, in my opinion, this is a rationalization for his change of position. I don't think he is really someone whose primary concern is the US's internal stability. I'm not saying that he hasn't some concerns about that, but I don't think that he believes, and that the others around him believe, that this is in actual jeopardy to the extent that he suggests. I think rather he has come to understand, as the other realists have, that the war in Ukraine is unwinnable, and there was a recent article in Foreign Affairs, one of the leading magazines closely connected to the Council for Foreign Relations, and written by Mr. Charab, one of the authors of that RAND Corporation report that appeared in January. There was actually an article in Foreign Affairs which actually referred to the war in Ukraine as the unwinnable war. Anyway, in parallel with the disclosure that, by NBC by the way, that these meetings were taking place in April, we, Mr. Haas and others, and Sergei Lavrov in New York, we now have another article in Foreign Affairs. And this article says, don't admit Ukraine into NATO. And in summary, what this article appears to say is this: if Ukraine joins NATO, it will bring colossal risks with it. Given the volatile situation between Ukraine and Russia, there is a very, very real risk, a very high risk, that Ukraine and Russia will continue to find themselves in a state of war, that they will be fighting each other. If Ukraine is a member of NATO, that will put NATO, and by that, of course, they mean ultimately the United States, in an impossible position. Do they act on the Article 5 commitment to defend Ukraine against Russia, which would mean, in effect, going to war with Russia, committing US troops to defend Ukraine from Russia, risking the high probability of a nuclear war with the world's biggest nuclear superpower, which is Russia? Or do they instead, in the event that Ukraine were to find itself in a conflict with Russia, even after it had become a member of NATO, do they instead back off? Do they abandon Ukraine to its fate, in which case the entire credibility of the Article 5 commitment is called into question, and with it, NATO's very existence is called into question as well? Article 5 having been exposed as a bluff, at least with respect to Ukraine. The question then is whether it is a bluff in respect to the defence of any other NATO member country that finds itself in conflict with Russia. And this article says, let's not go there. Let's not put ourselves in that position. And let's not, therefore, admit Ukraine into NATO. either now or, if you follow the logic of this point through to its conclusion, ever. Now, this is a very interesting, very important realization. And of course, it goes back to the origin of the war. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the origins of this current conflict, and I do intend eventually, soon, to do a dedicated program precisely covering this very topic. But most people who have not endorsed fully the Ukrainian and official Western line acknowledge that one of the underlying causes of the war was the relentless expansion of NATO eastwards, despite promises given first to the Soviets and then to the Russians at the end of the Cold War in the 1980s and in the early 1990s. Assurances, promises that NATO would not expand east, that it would not expand an inch east. And at the summit meeting that took place in Bucharest, NATO summit meeting that took place in Bucharest in 2008, the Russians made it absolutely clear that as far as they were concerned, NATO membership for Ukraine was an absolute red line. The US ambassador to Moscow, William Burns, currently the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, had already reported to Washington that he had been told by Russian officials that NATO membership for Ukraine was for the Russians an absolute, immovable red line. Anyway, notwithstanding that, notwithstanding those clear warnings repeated by the Russians during the Bucharest summit itself, notwithstanding all of that, notwithstanding the fact also, by the way, that at that time a large majority of Ukrainians were opposed to NATO membership for that country, notwithstanding all of that, the NATO at the Bucharest summit nonetheless went ahead and issued an invitation to Ukraine and also, by the way, to Georgia to apply to seek an invitation for NATO membership. And the Russians have repeatedly stressed how unacceptable that is to them, and this has been the major source of tension in this entire conflict. And of course, it has been massively aggravated by the change of power that took place in Ukraine in February 2014, when the previous government of Viktor Yanukovych, who had sought to maintain some kind of equidistance between Russia and the West, was overthrown, violently overthrown, in what I have no hesitation in referring to as a coup, and a coup that was supported by the West as well. Anyway, after that, it became clear that the new power structures that had taken control of Ukraine, the power structures which are still in being today and which, in effect, President Zelensky's government is both a successor and a part of, those power structures have insisted on NATO membership. There's been strong support for NATO membership for Ukraine from the neocons in the United States, neocons or people like them in Britain and in other countries. There's been relentless lobbying to bring Ukraine into NATO from all of these groups. And of course, this was in defiance of the Russian Red Line. And as recently as the autumn of 2021, the Russians issued proposals and presented 2 draft treaties to the United States and to NATO, which essentially sought an end of NATO expansion and specifically an end of NATO expansion into Ukraine. And had those agreements been reached then, had the Western powers in the autumn of 2021 agreed to these Russian demands, accepted Russia's repeatedly stated red lines about Ukraine's NATO membership, it's highly likely that the current conflict, the current war, would never have happened. And here we are. We've now come full circle. We've had a year and a half of intense fighting. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. Ukrainian cities have been shelled and devastated. 20% of Ukraine is now under Russian, or what the West says is Ukraine, is now under Russian control. Ukrainian army is being smashed by the Russians on these impenetrable Russian defenses. The Russian army is advancing again in northern Donbass and in Kharkiv region, threatening to recapture Liman and Kupiansk and other places, and to capture Siversk as well. And we've come full circle back to NATO membership. The question of NATO membership back in the autumn of 2021, NATO point blank refused to say that Ukraine would not join NATO. They said that it was a matter of principle for them that NATO maintained an open door to aspiring members, a principle which, by the way, has no existence. There's nothing that suggests that it exists in the Washington Treaty that established NATO all the way back in 1948. There's no word there of any kind of open door to other countries to join. But anyway, NATO insisted that this was a principle. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, talked about this at inordinate and, frankly, extreme and provocative length. And now we see articles appearing in Foreign Affairs which basically say we cannot have Ukraine in NATO. Having Ukraine in NATO is too dangerous. Let's not even think about it. Let's emphatically not go there. And we see that at the summit meeting that's coming in Vilnius, it looks as if, for the time being at least, this whole idea of NATO membership for Ukraine is being shelved. Nobody, apparently, wants to go to war with the Russians, except for a few neocons, perhaps, in Washington and London. People like Mr. Tobias Ellwood, more about him in a moment. But certainly that doesn't seem to be what the major European governments want. And it's now absolutely clear that there is a powerful, increasingly powerful lobby of people in Washington within the foreign policy establishment, people like Mr. Haas, who don't want to be put in that kind of position either. how much war, suffering, economic destabilization could have been avoided, would have been avoided, if that reality had been acknowledged back in the autumn of 2022, and if a simple agreement with the Russians had been reached then, that NATO would not expand to include Ukraine. Anyway, there we go. I have to say, we are now, as I said, in a situation where at least some people do seem to be starting to accept reality. We see that apparently there's not going to be an offer to Ukraine to join NATO in Vilnius. I don't think anybody expects that any longer. It seems there's going to be no timeline offered to Ukraine to join NATO in Vilnius. It seems that the ideas of deploying large numbers of Western troops, or at least East European troops, to Ukraine, that's, if not been completely shelved, there's little enthusiasm for it. It seems that there's no agreement yet, even about the kind of security assurances that Ukraine might be offered in the event that the conflict were to end. And those security assurances that have been talked about would only apparently be provided by some, but by no means all NATO states, and that they're being significantly watered down. But it's clear that there is still no real agreement as to how to move forward, and that there are still voices that are arguing in the other direction, and there are still steps being taken that point towards a continuing push for more escalation. How otherwise to explain this disastrous decision to supply Ukraine with cluster munitions? Now, Ukraine has had its own cluster munitions, and it has used them on the battlefronts. There are allegations that the Russians have done so as well, though actually don't find the evidence about this fully convincing. But anyway, I'm not going to go there. But anyway, the decision has now been made to provide Ukraine with cluster munitions. This despite the fact that there's been a major campaign to outlaw cluster munitions because of the indiscriminate nature of these munitions, the fact that they can cause civilian losses, the fact that cluster shells, bomblets, can lie around for a long, long time without exploding, and that they can cause deaths or injuries to people long after the battle, the fighting has ended, including children. Notwithstanding all of that, we see that the United States has now decided to provide Ukraine with cluster munitions. And the word is that the reason this is going to happen is because cluster munitions are an effective way of breaching defense lines. That might be true. I'm not an expert about these things, as I've said. I doubt that cluster munitions are very effective against concrete pillboxes or dragon's teeth or anything like that, but they might have some use against trenches and all the rest. But I would have thought that the most effective use of cluster munitions is not against defenders in fortified positions. It is against attackers trying to advance on those fortified positions across open country which is what Ukraine is currently doing. And the reason I make this point is because it seems that the Russians have a much bigger stock of these kind of munitions than the US does. And of course, if the US starts supplying cluster munitions to Ukraine, the Russians will probably start using them themselves. And as I said, they have large, huge stocks of these things. And of course, they also have thermobaric systems like the terrifying TOS-1 system. But the combination of cluster munitions with thermobaric systems like TOS-1, I would have thought would be deadly for any Ukrainian infantry assaults on Russian fortified positions, which is what we're seeing. So to me, at least, inexpert as I am in these things, this whole delivery makes little sense. Why then is the United States doing it? Well, I think there's two reasons for this. One is because they have relatively little other types of ammunition that they can supply to Ukraine. It could very well be that the fact that they're now supplying cluster munitions to Ukraine is a sign that Ukraine is running out of other types of ammunition, shells and ordinary conventional shells, and that this is all that the United States can now give. And by the way, it seems these weapons, these cluster munitions, these cluster shells are being drawn from stockpiles that are around 20 years old. Just saying. But anyway, that's one possibility. But of course the other, and it's the more troubling one in this context, is that it serves as another commitment to Ukraine at a time when there seems to be growing talk on the need to find some kind of diplomatic compromise. And the United States, the hardliners in the United States, perhaps intend to use this as a signal that they wish to double down and that they're not prepared to move or shift. They can't supply conventional shells, they will supply cluster shells, and they're still pressing for the ATACMS to be sent to Ukraine, and the F-16s, and all the others. So they haven't gone away, they're still there, they're still apparently arguing for escalation. And they're not the only people, because we have our hardliners elsewhere too. We have the hardliners like Mr. Tobias Ellwood, MP in London, who apparently is warning Britain that there's a war on in Europe in which Britain is involved, is complaining that Ukraine can't be left by itself to carry the burden of the war, the implication being that Britain should be directly involved. He actually used those words, which would imply that Britain actually enter the war in some way itself. Again, this has come up within Britain, come in for some criticism. Sources within the British military, in fact from the British Navy, the Royal Navy, have pointed out that Britain now has only 40 combat-ready tanks, and that its fleet is a fraction of its historic size, that it's in no condition to involve itself in this conflict in the way that perhaps Mr. Ellwood wants. I would say that I've seen this interview. I do feel that Mr. Ellwood, passionately committed to Ukraine, though he clearly is, I think that perhaps what happened was that he let his rhetoric run out of control. I'm not sure that if he takes a more cold and realistic view of things, he would necessarily want Britain to go to war with Russia, as some people say. But then perhaps I'm being generous. Anyway, let's put him aside. But anyway, so there are still hardliners. And of course, there's still the problem that European and US leaders, including President Biden himself, quite apart from their emotional commitment that no doubt some of them do feel for Ukraine, that they're also now disastrously overinvested in this whole enterprise. And it's very difficult for me to see how they come out of this conflict with their political reputations intact, unless they can achieve a kind of face-saving compromise, which I strongly suspect that by now the Russians have no interest in. With the Russians sensing that the war is going their way, is it not at least plausible that unless and until they get a proper proposal from the West which actually satisfies then their current demands, that they will instead see these initiatives from the West as a sign of weakness, and that might actually cause the Russians to harden their positions. I say that because whilst President Putin repeatedly says that he's open to negotiations, and I suspect that he would be open to negotiations if he was offered a proper plan that he could take to the Russian people and which he could say meets Russia's core interests, secures these territories for Russia, keeps Ukraine out of NATO, achieves demilitarization and denuclearization, and secures the position of Russian speakers in Ukraine. And here I have to say, I suspect that we've now reached the point where the Russians might actually insist on the presence of Russian troops in key places in Ukraine to protect Russian speakers. For example, in Odessa, this assuming, of course, that Odessa itself were to remain under Ukrainian control. Well, if he's presented with something like that, then I think he would be prepared to sit down and talk. He is that kind of a man. And beyond that, also, he probably recognizes that the international community, his friends in Beijing, in Delhi, in Ankara, in Tehran, in Brasilia, in Kuala Lumpur, and Jakarta, and in Hanoi, would all want him to do that. So I think he might be prepared to do that. But he's probably going to see, and other Russian officials will probably see, anything short of that coming from the West as a sign of weakness, as a sign that the West senses that it's losing, but also as a trap, another attempt to lead Russia into a shabby compromise like the Minsk agreement, which the West has no real intention of honouring. And Putin, who has had 2 decades of bitter experience of this, my strong feeling is that he has no stomach for that kind of compromise anymore, And besides, I think he realizes that Russian opinion would not countenance it. So, I think, and I come back to the points I've made in my previous programs, it does seem as if there is some talk now about the need for negotiations. President Erdogan, who seems to have who's perhaps sensing the change in the wind, he's now apparently spoken to President Zelensky, offered himself again as a possible mediator. The word is that he's going to speak to President Putin about this soon. But unless there is a clear Western position and an agreed plan, and one that the Russians feel that they can at least work with, then negotiations at this point are likely to fail. I'm not going to say that the Russians would refuse to sit down and talk to the West, but it would be like the Paris peace talks all over again. The Paris peace talks took place in the last years of the Vietnam War, a protracted and impossible negotiation in which American officials, including Henry Kissinger, made all kinds of proposals to the Vietnamese and found that the Vietnamese, by this point, had become implacable in demanding an outcome to the war, which in effect, when it was implemented, led to the collapse of South Vietnam. So, once again, the West wants to sit down and find a way out. They need to remember those words that were said by the German Chancellor Bismarck all those, well, more than a century ago, that when it comes to dealing with the Russians, it's better to do so straightforwardly or not at all. Well, thank you for joining me again today. See whether these negotiations crystallize into anything. I have my doubts, but anyway, that's where we are. More from me soon, and in the meantime, all that's left is for me to wish you a very good day, to remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various channels, locals, BitChute, Rockfin, Telegram, and of course also please remember, support our work. You could support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop, and also please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription if you've liked this video. Thank you again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.